It's 6:01 my time.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You are so welcome to the first Stockholm Explorative Talks 2023, with a focus on the extremely important question why highly skilled international people tend to be underemployed, which is often the case. This certainly needs to be discussed from different angles. During Stockholm Explorative Talks, the participating scholars represent widely different academic disciplines and come unrehearsed to the discussion. The main explorer briefly introduces the subject, and the co-explorers come into the discussion with their own academic perspectives. There is no moderator, the discussion is all improvised, and for that reason there will be no Q&A session, since we do not want to interrupt the discussion. You are a truly diverse and international audience today, representing a wide range of disciplines from all corners of the world, and we hope that you will enjoy the discussion, get new insights, and hopefully also have some fun. The explorer today is Laurence Romani, who is professor at the Department of Management and Organization and director of the Center for Responsible Leadership at Stockholm School of Economics in Sweden. Her co-explorers are first Carl Gombrich, who is academic lead at London Interdisciplinary School in the UK, Zainab Mirza, who is political scientist, a political commentator and lecturer at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. Third co-explorer is Bram Wassen, a postdoctoral researcher in philosophy at Umeå University in Sweden and a visiting fellow at Rutgers University in the US. Last but not least, the fourth co-explorer is Andrea Voyer, who is associate professor in sociology at Stockholm University in Sweden. The explorative talks will start with an introduction to today's subject by Laurence Romani, followed by a discussion between all five. So now the floor is yours, so enjoy.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. So as you said, we don't know what we're going to talk about when we know what the topic is of today. And so you asked me to prepare, to share my reflections and some of my ideas from my perspective of a management scholar on logics of inclusions. So I'll thought back about what is the research I've done recently, what are the case organization I worked with, and I tried to put something together. Hopefully it makes sense. So as I said, I come from a management perspective, and highly skilled person in management when you look at them from the perspective of the labor market, it's often that we are aware of the problem that they are underemployed. So that's not only in Sweden, where I'm located, but generally in Europe and in other parts of the world. So high skill means a person that has a bachelor degree at least, or extensive work experience. So really people that have skills, high skills. So generally, how do we explain the fact that those persons, highly skilled, are underemployed, that is not employed, or employed at the level that is below their qualification? And explanation usually run like this. Well, they do not have the right skill for the country they're moving to, or they do not speak the language properly, or they do not present their CV, in a way that makes sense for local organizations. And these are, very valid explanations. But what I'm missing here from an organization scholar perspective, I'm missing the organization, because who is giving work or who is granting access to work? Eventually, that's the organization. So I start asking myself, so how do we explain that these persons are not employed from an organization perspective? So I followed a couple of programs, what we call mentorship programs, so that person newly arrived in Sweden, because the case is in Sweden, are putting together in contact with a person already well established in society and working, and to share network, to share ideas and things like that. And I follow several programs like that. And in the end, what we get is that the program really trained migrants to fit into society. After 6 months, 6 weeks, it depends, the length of the program, you have many migrants who have the right skills. They speak Swedish. Some of them have been around for some years, and they really know well how to apply. LinkedIn has no secret for them. So here we have persons that have the right skills. They know how to sell themselves and they speak Swedish. And yet they are not employed. And or if they are employed, they are not employed at the level they should be. So then we start switching the question. Rather than thinking, okay, how come migrants or immigrants are not employed? We ask ourselves, and when I say we, it's my colleague Annette Risberg, we ask ourselves, could it be that organizations do not want to hire, or do organizations want to hire migrants? And that equipped with this question, we ask people involved in such programs, mentorship programs, and we ask them, okay, how do you make sense of the fact that we have a lot of high-skilled migrants not currently employed? And the answers were super interesting because we noticed a pattern. So the pattern was, well, you see, migrants, they could be a risk. Risk? What do you mean? So for organizational performance, for example, here I have a CV. I see the person has a master degree in economics, but a master degree in economics from this country of origin, what kind of skills do I get? I don't know them, okay? They will also mention that employing migrants could be a challenge for everyday work. What if clients don't want them? We have local clients. What do we say if they refuse to have this consultant from a Middle East background? Okay. Other concerns were about what do we do at work? I mean, what are we going to talk about at the coffee break? I have nothing in common with a person that has just, drifted for, I'm exaggerating, but basically, what are we going to talk about? Okay, so this was super interesting in itself, but also because migrants were presented as a potential risk. And here you need to understand how we understand risk. So take the example of a car. You have a supercar, like a beautiful sport car. In itself, the car is not a risk. It's just a car, right? However, if you put that car in the hands of an inexperienced driver, you have, potentially a lot of trouble, and it is potentially very dangerous. So the risk exists. The risk is relational. So it's because the car is driven by an inexperienced driver that this is very risky to the life of the driver. So here, what did we hear? We heard that a person with an international background was presented as a risk. So in terms of relation, we thought, okay, a risk to whom and why? And we realized that the persons presenting, or the narrative presenting migrants as a risk, were often coming from organizations that were ill-equipped to assess foreign skills, organizations that were not used to intercultural interactions at work, or organizations that were not used to international clients or having international clients. So it's because of we can put it like the shortcomings of the organization, like the unexperienced driver, that make them see migrants or present migrants as a threat. And then it makes sense to underemploy the migrants, because maintaining them in underemployment, that could limit their possible influence on the organization routines, on the organization performance, and so on and so forth. So the first logic we identified when I was asked to reflect upon that, it's I would say a logic of protection of existing normality, protection of existing status quo. What we have today is seen as more desirable than what immigrants could be. What we have and what we know is more desirable than what we can learn and what we can gain with migrants. This is what people were telling me. And then that brings me to the question, how is it in society at large? Do we also have a logic of protection? Like, I'm in Sweden. Do we try to protect Swedishness, the way it has been, the way some people maybe define it? Or do we have instead a logic of considering how it could be done? What could we have in the future? So this were first ideas. And then the second logic I could identify was a logic of benevolence. So that's another case organization. And this time there was an organization that was known to be like amazing regarding diversity. And they actually invited us as scholars to say, come study us because we're doing great things here. We have over 50 nationalities and we're employing a lot of people with a refugee background, migration background. Come study us. So, of course. And we ask around, again, qualitative research, doing interview with a lot of the employees, but we also did what we call a structural analysis. So we went through the organization chart and we look at every single employee. It was about 200 employees. And we look at them in terms of their education, degree of, experience, skills, where they were in the hierarchy, what were their prospects in the organization, what was their salary compared to other people in the same organization, and what was their ethnic background. And here too, to me, a very interesting image emerged, is that the HR, so human resource managers, so those really specialists of recruiting person, they were presenting their organization as a success story. They were the one inviting us, and they said, look, we have nationality, difference of nationality on possible levels. And they were also involved, and that was very impressive, in a lot of initiatives to make sure that they will reach out to communities, to underserved communities, to migrants, to professional schools where people with a migration background will come to gain a local degree. This was very impressive, and for them, a success story. But when we were talking to the persons working in the organization, themselves having a migration background, it was not a success story. They were much more critical in a sense. And they said, an inclusive organization, I'm not so sure. And actually, we're pretty stuck here. And we realized with doing the analysis that they were stuck into a logic of non-mobility, so they couldn't really progress in their career. And also they were stuck into saying, thank you for saving me from the difficult situation in which I was coming to Sweden as a migrant with nothing. So what we realized is that the person who were at the initiating all those attempts to, all those initiatives, for the integration of person with a migration background was that they wanted to help. So their motivation was really well intended, and they were in solidarity with the person seen as in need of help. But then they would see and approach the person with migration background as a victim, a person in despair, in need of help, rather than a potential talent for the organization. There were some, we need to help them, okay? But this creates an unequal relationship where there is one person who can give help and the other one who is, receiving help. And that creates an unequal relation. And help was granted, but with the expectation that the person will stay put. So we heard like many examples, and I try to summarize it in one quote. The person was saying, those from the Middle East, they are so pushy, they are in the production process. I know they're well trained. They have this master degree from Syria, from, in chemistry. But they are so pushy. We don't need to develop. We don't need to try to have new clients from the Middle East. We don't need to have new this and that. So they were conveying the fact that they wanted those persons to stay at the position where they entered the organization and where they were given access to work. And the immigrants were stuck in the discourse of gratitude. So this to us became a logic of benevolence. You actually reproduce the existing hierarchy of those well-established, those least established, the Swedes, the non-Swedes, but also it was an aspect of race, of whiteness and non-white. And I was wondering, is it also like that in society in general? Do we have this logic of benevolence towards the immigrant, as long as they say put and to the bottom of the social or racial hierarchy we have? Is it what we're doing? Is it what we're expecting? Or do we instead try to promote logics of equality and mobility? So to conclude, and thinking about these two examples, my reflections are that I could identify two logics. So in the first case, this was a logic of protection of what we have, right? protection of 2 days. What we do in the organization is great, and we don't want to put that at risk with hiring someone who's different. And then in the second case, it was the logic of benevolence. Like, inclusion is a favor made to other people, and they should be grateful, kind of. So all in all, I'm wondering, are we not here talking about some kind of worth? And worth, some kind of worth, merit, I don't know which word to use. But in the first case, what we had today was worth more than what we could have. And in the second case, Swedishness, being a local person, was worth more than coming from a different background. And what about society in general again? And this is why it's so great to have, so many of you from different expertise. What about society? Do we also have this regime of worth? How do we define merit? How is the desirable migrant defined in our society? Is it someone who is not going to endanger what we have, and then a logic of protection? Or is it someone that's going to help us grow? How do we think about inclusion? And basically that's it. That's as far as I come. So now I'm turning to you and just, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So who wants to start?
I can, if you want, just being from the Middle East myself. And first of all, I want to say that it's a pleasure to be amongst you all. And again, the study of immigration is a latecomer to our discipline. As a political scientist, I'm worried about two things. This melting pot metaphor. I want to see migrants really adopting the value of the countries that they belong to. And here it's very important for the country to speak their language, meaning, I don't know, what do they identify with, especially if it's also a religion, certain religion, and to try to help them understand it more. And then I think it's also very much related to the rise of the far-right parties, politically speaking, that we were witnessing in Europe. So immigrants supposed to be an added value. They're supposed to bring benefits, essential benefits to themselves and to the country. But at the same time, if they, of course, there should be a will to include them, and they themselves should be willing. So from what you said, you were as if you were saying that these immigrants, they did everything they could, and they pursued programs, training programs, and still as if they were not accepted properly. This is what, did I understand right? That even if they follow intensive program, they still are seen as different. Yeah, well, to me, it's just it's from a conservative point of view. I want to hear someone else now. This is just a little input from a political science point of view.
I'll jump in. I was struck. Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Britta and Maria, for inviting me. I was struck a little bit by some research done in the UK here around class. Now, class is perhaps a particularly British thing, but it does exist everywhere in the world, and there's a very strong class divide in this country along the lines that you describe for migrants and immigrants. So I don't even think it's necessarily around racism or migration, but around just groups, in-groups and out-groups, power groups and non-power groups. And this study that was then aired on the BBC certainly showed that, people of equal intelligence and equal qualification in this country who have, for example, a very strong regional accent are much less likely to get those graduate jobs and those white-collar jobs than people from famous expensive schools, famous expensive universities, and so on. So equal competence doesn't equal fair outcome for people even within a country if you're of a different class. So I think conversation is a bit wider with regard to inclusion and exclusion than just migration, although of course that migration does bring out some very stark contrasts.
I would love to take a moment to respond to this because it really resonates with some of the work that I do on what I call the etiquette or manners of inequality. Because Carl, just you now and Laurence, earlier you mentioned that the people will make distinctions on the basis of manners or etiquette, your accent, if you seem to be pushy. And this is something I have observed in my work, that there are a lot of dimensions that we can use to make distinctions between people. And very often they're very practical dimensions. So it's less about what your credentials are and more about these soft things that people don't necessarily have a way to even put into words a lot of the time. And so I think that really brings forward the question about, you asked, how do we define merit? And then the other question is, who's defining merit? Who is the person? And so I think that's one thing that comes up for me here. So thinking about these norms of of an organization, norms of a society, and the way that they're built in relation to the conception of a particular insider.
Yeah.
Can I just add something about, I find this question about merit and how people are somehow obstructed from getting what they deserve for all kinds of soft reasons, as Andrea put it, which I like. We all, like, it's the thing we all know, but somehow theorists are ignoring, is like how you say things is just as important as what you say, and like the way you appear. Like everybody knows from kindergarten that the kids with nicer clothes are, more fun to hang out with than the kids in less nicer clothes. Like we all feel this, we all know this. It's not talked about. And there's a worry, I think, if I summarize what Lisa said, that like there's this unjustified obstruction for these people to get what they deserve, the positions they deserve, the kind of employment they deserve. And I think that's one very powerful way to put the problem. But I'm wondering whether there's another powerful way to put the problem that might hold more sway over the kind of institutions that we would need to change, which is just, if that's the case, if we are obstructing people who deserve a job more or are at least equally intelligent, we're just losing out as an institution on just being a better institution. We might have gotten better engineers if we hadn't like discriminated based on accent, race, whatever it is we're discriminating on. Like the spectrum is probably immense. And I'm wondering whether there's any study, or because coming from a philosophy background, I don't do the empirical questions. They require mathematics and that kind of stuff. That's way too hard for me. But I'm wondering whether there's any hard studies about like what kind of motivations do help to convince institutions to change their attitudes. Because from a very, perhaps a bit cynical, but also uneducated view, the idea is that companies and institutions, they're driven by they want gains in whatever abstract way you want to put that. And maybe just telling them that, like, listen, you're not giving these people, your employees, what they deserve, might not be as compelling as saying you're missing out on being a better company. And I'm wondering whether there's any kind of work that any of you know of in this area helping us go forward.
Yeah, there's lots of work, isn't there, Lawrence, on the benefits of diversity, lots of studies of that. And I think there's also lots of work on how people resist diversity. So that's the interesting thing, you put them together. People don't want the hard work of working with people who don't get their jokes, who are a little bit odd on a Friday when they want to go out drinking, whatever it might be. But if you do force that diversity, you get a lot of positive outcomes. Is that right, Lawrence and Lena, that you know?
There is a lot of research on diversity indeed, and what we call the business case. So what is the value, mercantile value for the organization? But actually for working with organizations, first of all, this is questionable whether we should have a business case rather than a moral case of a social justice case. I mean, think of the following. Think of an organization telling us, well, you have to show me the benefit for me to employ a woman, because if I don't see the benefit of employing a woman or having, like, gender equality in my organization, why should I care? And I think this attitude is no longer echoing the sustainable needs we have of inclusion of multiple population, in business. But the second point is that they know the business. And I mean, you have consulting reports and also research-based evidence that you gain like X% in profitability, 12% on this, or 55% on that. And still, it's not happening. It's not happening to the degree that it could. Okay, so, and I'm not sure whether this is resistance of, I don't want to call it resistance, because if you see a person with a migration background as a threat, you're not resisting, you're protecting, you're doing something very reasonable. And that's why it's tricky. The value, we know it, it's demonstrated, it's known, but it's not happening to the extent it could. And then one aspect, there is what you call also the moral case. And a lot of organizations today are saying we want to be good citizens, and we want to employ, we want our employees to reflect the society we are active into. And yes, often it's related to business case, but organizations are not just about profit. Otherwise, they would be more diverse.
And plus, if they did employ them with the right salaries, they would end up paying taxes more. Just also to note another aspect of it, that usually immigrants coming to this, what we call pays d'adaptation, they are there in this new country, they bring more than their luggage with them, they want to prove themselves. And also what you said is very dangerous. For example, if, when you leave everything behind and you are looking for a new place to call home, you want to do your best. You want to give your best, usually. And you said that they found them too pushy. So this is also not speaking the language. This is dangerous because, what is the norms in here? What is pushy? Pushy because maybe they're used to opening up, pushy because, usually in the Middle East, we grow up learning 2 or 3 languages. In my country, Lebanon alone, we are like 3 languages. We start this very early at school, and we are open, and the culture always is pushing us to be more and more open and to understand more and to try to adapt as much as we can. Yes, I think there is a lot of misunderstanding. And as we were saying, if they do integrate them in the proper way, there would be lots and lots and lots of benefits, starting with the simple fact of being more taxpayers as citizens. It will be, I know it's not all about the financial thing, but and I also want to note another thing. I think we should, European countries, from my point of view, should encourage immigrants, and they should look the same in a way. People are afraid from others when they look so much different. I understand that this is, especially, I'm sure Andrea would know more to comment from a sociological point of view, but it's always this fear of someone is different. Even forget about the accent, just the whole look, outside look. So I insist on them really adopting all the values as much as they can, and having a training program to do so.
So you're saying, Zainab, that when you move to another country, you should change yourself and transform yourself to fit the local values and traditions? I'm pushing you, right?
It's not transforming myself. If I want to upgrade, it's an upgraded version of me. If I move to a new society, I moved there willingly. I moved there. I killed myself to arrive, because that this is a very lengthy procedure, and usually they only take crème de la crème. They are not taking anyone. So they should be educated. So if I'm killing myself, if I am endangered in my country, endangered because, we all know the problems that we're facing in the Middle East, whether in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, everywhere else. So if I will have the chance to move and to have, we appreciate a lot the concept of peace. Now we appreciate having electricity and water and basic stuff and our basic right. But let's go back to the peace thing, okay? Maslow's hierarchy, peace, just peace. Me, my kids, we are safe. And I have the opportunity to give them the best of education, the best of everything. So I don't think it's, I think, yes, I should do some compromise, and I should try to fit, because fitting will also reflect much more positively on me and my family than on the society. You see what I mean? I know maybe someone would come and tell me, for example, if I am veiled, or I am maybe I this is my religion, I cannot, and all of this and that. But here also we can, I can talk for hours on subjects like this. This is why I said speaking their language, meaning knowing their value, their culture, and trying to tell them what's the best way to, yes, I am, you understood me right. Yes, they need to do some compromise because it's good for them at the end of the day. Nothing that would hurt them, nothing that would clash dramatically with their, of course, their own values and everything. But at least I think they should look, I mean, this melting pot thing, they should look that part of it, and they should act with the will and maybe if I use the word gratefulness, people will say that what am I talking about? But I think yes, I allow myself, coming from this part of the world, to say we are grateful when we move to a country where our children are in peace.
I would love a chance to hop in here if that's okay. I really appreciate what you just shared, Zainab, but I would like to offer something, a question about the way that power plays a role in here, because I'm an immigrant in Sweden from the United States who came here for an academic job. So I don't feel any sense that I need to be grateful to be here. I'm glad that I got the job, but I applied with a bunch of other people in a competitive process, and I got that position. And I came here to Sweden, and of course, learning the language, not being disruptive. There are some things that, of course, when you come to a new country, you might expect you have some obligations, but I don't think immigrants have any particular extra demands that should be placed on them than other people who are granted a place to be in a country. And I don't think they should be judged by any particularly different criteria just because they were born somewhere else when they apply for a job. So I guess I would push back on that. And in sociology, we talk about this in terms of what different modes of immigrant incorporation is the term that we use in sociology. And so usually we talk about there being kind of three modes of incorporation in a general sense. So these could be mixed or whatever. But if you can think about, the first one would be an assimilation model, which is you arrive as an immigrant and your goal as an immigrant is to become indistinguishable from the people and the society that you've entered. You learn the language perfectly, you dress just like everyone else, you eat what they eat at lunch, you blend in. And it's not just this thing about blending in on the things that you think are important, because as we were just talking about in terms of manners, we don't know what everyone else thinks is important. You just have to be indistinguishable in an assimilation model. And then we also have the idea of hyphenation, which is that as long as you behave correctly at work, it doesn't matter what you do outside of work. So you can kind of maintain your non-native status as this thing that happens outside of your public life. And then the third is this idea of a more multicultural incorporation. And there, a little more of the responsibility falls on the society. So if we think of a social group as a collection of rights and obligations we have to each other in a sense of shared identity and the distance that we take from each other, then a multicultural model says that it's about recognizing the value in the room. And this is more this business case for diversity type of discussion as well, that when you have a conversation where everyone can express their views, maybe you come to a better decision types of things.
I think I was misunderstood when I said, because, you came from a country that is not in war. And I was just saying that maybe they'll become pushy because to them, they cannot go back to, Andrea, whatever happens, maybe you have the chance to go back home, a place to call home. But these people, I think most of them are this will become their home. So this is why I said it's to their benefit to try to blend in. This is all I was saying, that usually they don't have this luxury of going back somewhere else. So
I agree completely, but it's also, I feel very much in my personal life, my power as somebody who has a native language of English, which is a status language, as opposed to a language that is criticized. And I don't think I deserve that extra power status that I get from what I bring. So I think one of the things is, what are we asking of immigrants and migrants when they come? What demands are we making? And are those reasonable demands? And then what responsibility does everyone else have to include and to bring people in and to be the new society that you're inevitably going to be when you bring in a lot of people from other places?
Definitely. It's a two-way. Absolutely. Sorry.
I would think, as usual, there's a lot of nuance and detail here that makes the discussion more difficult. That depending where you're from and the relationship between your country and the country you're migrating to, there must be all sorts of different emotions. Recently, you probably follow the news. We have a lot of xenophobia in this country and concern about people coming across the water in dinghies. And there's been a lot of discussion on the difference between someone from Afghanistan or Iraq coming to the UK, where UK has certainly been implicated in destroying those countries one way or another the last 30 years, and someone coming from Albania. There were thousands of Albanian migrants for whom really Britain has very, very tenuous, if any, responsibility, frankly, as far as I know my history. And I think these nuances are really, really important. But how often can they actually be honored and respected? If you're a Swedish or a British person, you see people look vaguely similar from Afghanistan, Iraq, or Albania in your organization, I think it's actually probably right to make some distinctions and say, you guys, come on, you should assimilate a bit more. There's no very hard reason for you to be so sort of exclusive about your views. Whereas you guys, we kind of owe you because we've really messed up your lives. And so we should do a bit more kind of moving towards you. But I think those kind of nuances are almost impossible to carry out in society, unfortunately.
I think maybe adding even more nuance to this, I think there's this difficulty. I mean, we talked earlier about how ineffable these class distinctions and race distinctions actually ingrain our life. And when I think about how you should adapt to your local country, it's actually very ineffable to know what that even is.
Exactly.
So there's these examples from I think it was the Netherlands. This is very anecdotal. I'm not an empirical researcher, blah, blah, blah. But from the Netherlands, where they did these citizen tests about whether or not you adopted the Dutch values properly. But what it showed was that if a Dutch citizen took it, they would fail miserably, right? So the idea that there's sort of this, I mean, whatever stance you take on the measure of how much you should adapt to a certain country, it is, once we take that stance or whatever we're going to do, it's such a almost logistical nightmare to make you genuinely adapt to something. And I personally, so I moved from Belgium to Sweden, and now I live in the US at least for a few years. And none of these are huge gaps culturally, I would say. And language-wise, it's easy as well. But when doing that, a lot of people will ask these things like, oh, like, how is this in Belgian culture? And I typically don't know what they're talking about. Or when I go back, they'll say like, oh, we Belgians, we do this. And it's like, that's not my experience at all. I have no idea what you're talking about. So even as somebody who grew up in Belgium and lived there until he was 23 or 24, I don't really know what Belgian culture is supposed to be. So let alone coming there as an immigrant from an entirely different place, being told like you should integrate in our culture. I don't know what we're asking of these.
Bram, in Britain, we might make a joke that that's particularly Belgian to not know what your culture is or might be. I think there are some Brits. There are some things. Sorry?
I think you're not off on that count. I think that is particularly Belgian, yes.
I think there are some things that we would agree are British, more or less. But yeah, it's certainly very fuzzy. And increasingly fuzzy as we all enjoy. I mean, the famous example, the great British national dish is the curry. Now, there's almost no question of that. It's a curry which generally comes from Bengal or Bangladesh, and you find it in every tiny village. Tudor Elizabethan village in Britain has a curry house, and that's the favorite dish of the local people. So these things do change and are often surprising and quite fun. But I think there are still some cultural differences. And I would say learning the language, which Zainab referred to as well, that seems to me a kind of a baseline for anyone to really make the effort to learn the local language and be provided with resources to learn the language as well.
in many levels. When I said learning the language, I mean just the culture, the tradition, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what how the majority will see me odd. Do I really look odd? Should I behave in this way? It was acceptable in my country, but will they judge me? Will they judge my kids? Will I be able to to belong simply? So it's tough. I'm sure it's tough.
Can I move discussion somewhere completely different just to see how we get on?
Sure.
So I work in an interdisciplinary school, the first really radically interdisciplinary university in the UK. We're set up with no departments and no disciplines, all problem-based learning and or using whatever methods we think are appropriate to tackle the problem. And of course, the interest for our undergraduates is what they will do after this degree. And the answer is pretty much anything and everything. I ran a similar program at UCL in London, the big university there, which had similar questions asked about it. And the graduates from that program are just doing incredible things in the world of work, in this globalized, digital, knowledge economy-based world. And so I wanted to actually query, Lawrence, some of your remarks about, these people are highly qualified, they've got the right certification, because I actually think the certifications in many of these modern jobs are not really important anymore. You're just as likely to get a good job from Ernst & Young on LinkedIn from having an interesting profile showing lots of interesting things you've done as having an MSc from the London School of Economics and all these things. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a bit culturally specific to the UK and somewhat less the US, but I think in all advanced capitalist economies now, big white-collar employers are saying, what is it with these old-fashioned certifications about economics or history or, these aren't the jobs. These are not the jobs my graduates are doing. They're product managers, they're program managers, they're project managers. They're across big spaces of knowledge. And this is relevant to the cultural and diversity piece because we need people who can talk to all sorts of different stakeholders, who can build little teams, who understand new connections. We don't want old-fashioned certificates in, this 20th century or 19th century discipline. That's part of the piece, but definitely not sufficient for the sort of graduate we're looking for. And I do think the point about that in this discussion is that people coming from outside Europe have a much more traditional and siloed view of what education should be, and that maps onto a really quite outdated, 30, 40, 50-year outdated view of what the labor market actually is in more advanced capitalist countries. So I don't think it's just sort of soft and fuzzy. I think actually many of these migrants say, I'm an electrical engineer, and people say, okay, fine, but I want you to go into this community, work with this people on this project. You also got to work with local authority, you've got to work with economists, maybe even a philosopher might be in the room, Brown, if it's a policy group. And in those sorts of roles, of which there are now millions of jobs, people with traditional qualifications who don't think very broadly and come from a more siloed cultural view will struggle. So I wonder if that's also playing into the selection process.
But what triggers me in your question is, I think it's a relevant question in the sense that we are training in general, and I'm talking from the position of a business school. Okay, so we're training people to be very multifaceted, to be able to be project managers. So in what I would call social science, maybe this is the case. If you have a bachelor in arts, yes, this is the case. But so you do have a point. But what I'm triggered is that you put it in two ways. The first one is that this applies across disciplines. And when I'm working with people, they need to have a degree in chemistry. They need to be able to put polypropanol, I don't know what it was, together, and they need to know how to make this work for creating medicine. You need to have some hard skills.
We need data here, right? We need data.
But the second point is, wait. The second aspect is that those people coming from more traditional perspectives, highly skilled migrants come from Germany to Sweden or from the US to Sweden. They are not coming from, the non-global north. Okay, so let's not assume that they are simply backward and that's why they don't have a job, because really trigger me when you say something like that.
So I grant you the second part. I didn't know we were talking about European migrants here. I thought we were talking about migrants from the global south. On the first point, we do need data, because I think there's a misconception about the number of those highly specific disciplinary jobs compared to the number of less specific jobs at the graduate level in the modern world. The data I have is from the UK, but we do know that a very large sample of all graduate employers in the UK, this was done in 2019 by an umbrella organization that does research, so that 87% of all graduate employers in the UK do not care, in strong words, not even very diplomatic words, do not care what discipline the student studied at university. 87%. It's a headline news I see every talk I give. So in the UK, you can study French history and go and join the central bank. You can study economics and go and work for a drug company in sales. You can study sales and go and work for a football team. It doesn't matter. The link between a discipline and graduate employment is 9/10 broken in the UK. Now, that's very weird. And it may be weird because the jobs are not what we think they are, or it may be weird because the UK has all sorts of other weird cultural differences. But it is a fact in the UK. And I think it's probably something closer to what we realize in most European and American countries too. So I think I grant you your second point, because I misunderstood the sorts of migrants we're talking about. But I think on the first point, actually, we need far, far fewer chemical engineers than we actually think in modern post-capitalist societies.
So one of the things I think we could think about, though, is the relationship. So how are people being selected for jobs if your major doesn't matter? Because just because your major doesn't matter, it doesn't mean that there aren't some other signals of eliteness. For example, what school you go to or what sports you play. I mean, there's actually lots of sociological literature about polish in job interviews and in recruitment to elite jobs, and the way that all kinds of back to the soft background things and norms gets in there. So we could think of it as an advantage that your major doesn't matter, your program doesn't matter, but we could flip that around and say, actually, perhaps it's a little more challenging for someone when they can't just come out with a really good chemistry degree and be a person who's in line for the position because they haven't played the right sports or they don't have the correct accent from the right
That's exactly
school.
my point. That's my point, Andrea. All I want to say is it divorces the stuff, the content that Lawrence brought up right at the beginning between high certification and all this soft stuff we're talking about. I completely agree with everything you just said. My challenge was to look, these guys have got amazing degrees in electrical engineering. Why aren't they getting great jobs? It's precisely because of everything you just said. Because the electrical engineering is much less important actually for a lot of jobs than we think, unfortunately, maybe.
So do we think that the challenges that Laurence has been discussing is just part of the explanation of the data point that Carl just brought us? It seems to be of a package, right? The way we're putting this together is, wait a minute, there's this puzzle. Wait a minute, why do these people not get employed? They're brilliant at what they do. And the answer is, like, we've been actually, without perhaps noticing it, been veering away from the hard qualification model to sort of like, you give me the good vibes model. And then the problem is that good vibes are so, ineffable that they're very hard to teach or very hard to learn.
That's something I've been wondering, right? Because Laurence, you talked about the logic, two logics of exclusion, right? So, and then we talked about the business case as a logic of inclusion. But what are the other logics of inclusion in practice? We can come up with some that we think would be better for bringing about more equal systems, but what are the actual logics of inclusion that are operating that allow this underemployment of skilled migrants?
I don't know, but I'd be very interested to have more forced inclusion. I think would be great, because I think once people get over that hump of diversity is hard, we actually all quite enjoy it. Well, a lot of people quite enjoy it. A lot of people love learning from difference, but we all resist difference in the first instance. And so I'd be all for all sorts of recruitment practices which actually oblige organizations to take very different people, because I think they benefit. Everyone will benefit in the longer run.
And then you will force those people to stay in the organization as well?
No,
Until
I think
it works?
well, I mean, no, they should move on. You could get other people in who are different again, I guess, but some kind of continual welcoming of difference, welcoming of otherness into the organization, I think would be positive for everyone.
But actually, that touches on something very sensitive. I don't know whether it's sensitive, but the idea of quota. So I studied another organization, and that was in recruitment. And that was very interesting because you could see how the group that was recruiting to somehow to reproduce itself. So they had a diversity of skills, and they were looking for the same diversity of skills. But they were also had a great diversity of gender, ethnicity, disciplinary background, and they were reproducing that. And then I was wondering, okay, so what if we force, like Carl, what you were saying, what if we force a recruiting team to be diverse? It's mandatory in this organization that a recruiting team should have different expertise. Will they then lead to more diversity? And there is some research showing that diverse teams tend to recruit more diverse. But then Carl, I like what you said. Should we force that?
I mean, it's for me. Sorry, I'm talking too much now, but for me, it's got to be sort of a soft push, because I mean, what is diverse? I'm the only person here with grey in my beard. Does that make me diverse? I mean, we don't really know where this argument ends. We have some idea about gender, race, transgenderism now, but there are all sorts of dimensions of diversity which make the kind of reductio argument that you have to be as diverse as possible virtually impossible to implement. Political views, do we include that when we look at diversity? Certainly universities could benefit from having far more right-wing people in them. They're way too homogenous in their thinking, universities. But do we force that? Do we say we're not having another left-winger in the sociology department? Andrea, what do you think? I mean, it's a joke, but the point is, where does diversity begin and end? So when I say force, I mean, I was being a bit provocative, Lawrence. I mean, I think every organization should be alive to diversity and should ask themselves, are we provoking ourselves enough by making a hire which is different to our organization, which will challenge us in our views that we have at the moment? I suppose that's what I mean by recruitment diversity.
But do they want to be challenged?
Well, they should. I don't know, but they should. I think that's how they'll do better.
We should say so. Zainab, I'm curious. I mean, what about at the level of a society? I mean, here I'm really turning to the political scientist, and here we're talking about, okay, this force is not the word is not force, but this idea of that, like imposing a little bit or giving strong guidance. Do migration policy or integration law serve that kind of purpose? I really don't know here.
I think so. I told you. I mean, this far-right parties, the rise of these far-right parties means something. They won the election in Italy, and I mean, they will win eventually. So what I'm sensing is that I don't see a good integration model almost anywhere. So, and I think a lot should be done, because again, if it's not inclusion, this would be devastating. It would have a devastating impact on trust, on morale, on productivity, on everything. So yes, I think they should impose a harsh maybe training program. And I know maybe you don't agree with me, but I'm just talking here about people coming from the Middle East. I'm not talking about the North. I'm saying people that really come from a very, very different background, and they look different, and they have very different culture, habits and all of this. So I think if really they want to be accepted, they need to do an effort about it, and the government should help organizations, the recruitment processes, like you said, and the organizations, and they should all know that, as in politics we say, it has to be a win-win. If it's not a win-win, it will not work. So they would know that by doing this, they will be benefiting, the society will be benefiting, the organization will be benefiting, at the government level, taxpayers. So everything, it's a win-win thing, really, honestly. And what I really don't, I mean, personally speaking, what sometimes breaks my heart when I go somewhere. I grew up mostly in Europe myself, and when I go in different European countries, and then even in the States, and then I see, like, a whole region of people coming from a certain area, and then they transform this area into their tiny country of theirs, and they don't adopt anything. And it's like, I know it's good, diversity is good, but I mean, this is for some people, some other citizens would be offended. Why are you here if you want to live exactly as you were? So this is also very debatable. I mean, people could agree, could not agree. But I think if we really, it has to be a melting pot. It has to be a melting pot. This diversity definitely could give a lot. And I am a believer that, as Carl was saying, that eventually they will understand, and they will accept the fact, and they will feel the benefit of having such a diverse. But the problem here, it's two faces of the coin, meaning the society should accept this inclusion, and they themselves should be willing to to blend in.
So I appreciate that. Was a great comment, and it got me thinking about this, something that I often tell my students when I teach about my courses in ethnicity and integration, that sociology is a discipline that has looked at immigrants settling in new countries. It's been like one of the core subjects of sociology for the history of sociology. So we have 100 years of research really looking at what happens when immigrants go from one country to another. And the thing is that what we see in that 100 years of research is that the idea that when folks arrive in a new country, they settle with other immigrants, and very often with immigrants from their own country, is really common. I mean, that's exactly how the US was settled by all kinds of ways of immigrants, with Chinatowns and Little Italies and I could go on and on just listing neighborhoods that have this association. And the thing is, there are lots of really good reasons for that. And it's not usually about not wanting to blend in. It's about the fact that Native people often haven't faced the same challenges in dealing with migration bureaucracy, for example. Or when you move to a new country, and it might be nice to have people who understand the language while you're trying to learn the other language, or people to celebrate the holidays with, to compensate for the family that you left behind, right? So there are a lot of reasons that immigrants live near other immigrants. And so as a sociologist, I say, when is this a problem? Well, it's a problem if their kids and their kids' kids. So if by that second generation, they have not moved, if that neighborhood still persists without continued migration from that country, then what you're seeing is some persistent exclusion and the segmentation of an ethnic group, an ethnic minority group, as opposed to an immigrant group. So I think that's something I try to really talk about a lot, because I think, again, it's hard to be an immigrant. Immigrants go through a lot. They give up a lot. It takes, on average, 5 to 10 years for immigrants to even feel any baseline level of comfort and cultural fit with the new country. So we really have to think of this as a long-term thing. We can't say, oh, they've been here 2 years, why aren't they in? We're saying, what about their kids? So I just want to put that out there, because this is, we know this in sociology. We've seen it in pretty much every national context.
I'm also wondering about this, let's call it the clustering worry, that these groups stay cohesive and adopt their own little version of a culture they have at home. Again, this is not a solution or anything insightful. This is more adding in different layers. There's some evidence that there is some external pressure from the local country to actually do that, right? There's these stories like Chinatowns. They existed not just because the Chinese wanted to live in all of the same places and that's just what they want. They were forced into these regions, and then they made it look like a Western idea of what China would look like, just to become more accessible and manageable for the And I say the locals because I'm thinking of San Francisco in specific. Nobody was fucking local at the time. But anyway, let's call them the non-Chinese inhabitants who wanted to sort of like a manageable version in their head to process, and that's what Chinatown became. And it was a whole political struggle, and a lot of decisions went into that. But that wasn't just because these people wanted to hang out with themselves, so to speak, right? So just to add another layer of the difficulties of, let's say, the clustering worry, is it is not coming only from the immigrants. It's coming from all of us wanting to have information in manageable packages, so to speak. And it's very hard to overcome that because we're limited in the kind of cognitive processing we can do in that way.
And even at the organizational level. So very frequently services for immigrants are provided in immigrant neighborhoods. So there's a solidification sometimes of how these things are set up, that the state's actually working to localize its dealings with migrants in those types of neighborhoods.
Is there any work on which immigrants have I hesitate to use the word assimilated, Andrea, if that's, there's only one of the categories, but have integrated, let's say, extremely well versus those that haven't? And do we know why the communities that have integrated really well have integrated well?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the national context, and there are a lot of different theories about this. But a lot of it talks about, for example, arriving already knowing the language, shared religion, because you're coming into the same places of worship. So, your baseline coming in with credentials that are actually recognized. So these kinds of things, but also the presence of prior immigrants who are more established from your home country, which can facilitate access to networks and jobs and information. So there are a lot of theories out there and research that talks about these kinds of factors and shows that they're important for understanding what we would say is the trajectory of immigrant incorporation.
But that's interesting. All things being equal then, Andrea, does religion and language trump race as a factor for being able to integrate?
I cannot answer that question. Sorry.
These are really interesting.
What do you think, everyone?
Well, I have something that stuck with me when I was studying migration. Like I grew up in France, and in the south of France, and not too far from a city called Marseille. And in Marseille, in the beginning of 1900, there were a lot of migrants from Italy. And there were demonstrations and riots and streets, things happening
exactly
against the Italians because they had a different religion. Okay?
What was the
there
religion?
were those Italians that are carrying, statues of Maria or whatever in the street. This was so different. So because of their different religion, Roman Catholic, they were perceived as impossible to integrate in Marseille.
Marseille
People
wasn't
died
Catholic.
because of this.
Marseille wasn't Catholic?
Yes, of course. My point is, the way you define religion.
Exactly.
If among Catholics, they don't even recognize themselves as having the same religion, where are we going here? And same with race, race. People change race during their life, depending on the regulation of that country, the country they live in. So,
yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, and that's to me, this is what's so tricky, because it's not that we have one variable that will explain, proximity or race or religion, of age, of whether they wanted to leave or not, and that's why it's so complex. I mean, obviously. But there is something I'd like to go back to. Andrea, you said, so you have in sociology 100 years of data on migration and integration. And you said it doesn't have to be a problem. When is it a problem? And if I understood you well, you said when there is no mobility, when people are stuck, so geographically or socially. Yeah. Why is it a problem? Because they are stuck because they are forced in a place because they cannot. Why is being stuck? What is a lack of mobility a problem?
Well, just as you talked about when you're with your logics in the of exclusion and organization, right? We got you here, we gave you the job, don't expect to get promoted. Likewise, usually by the second generation of immigrants, so the people who came, their kids, and their kids after. So, in sociology, we usually say by that third generation that's there, they usually have parity. They look about like everyone else in terms of their income, their education, their how American or whatever nationality they feel. So the assumption is that if that hasn't happened by the third generation, then you have to ask what's going on. So when I said a problem, that's what I mean by a problem, that this is not what we expect, not what we expect. We expect by the grandkids that this is a group that's intermarrying, they're getting just as educated, they have the same, they look the same on paper as everyone else.
Here also, we have to also take into consideration what Bram has said about sometimes bad decisions taken by governments themselves when they, for example, if I want to compare France to UK quickly, I think UK managed in a way to integrate in a much, much better way when they scatter, these special houses for comers, whereas in France, maybe le banlieue, like when they are in the suburbs and then they become, they feel they are, neglected. And then the second and the third generation, instead of, like Andrea was saying, being integrated and looking the same, they are like more and more alienated, and they feel that, and this will create a grudge. And I think we all know what's going on now. So, and anytime something small happens, they explode because they are so angry, so repressed, and they feel that their government is not, they're not like equal citizen in a way, in a country where like it was, the revolution was on égalité, fraternité, and all this liberté. So this is, they should take care. This is basic. It's not, it's multi-layered, and people, many apparatus should work all together in order to have this integration thing. So the willingness of the society, the willingness of the people coming, proper government laws, and not to take bad decisions, proper training, and then showing everyone, as I said, this win-win equation, that if we do it right, it's going to be beneficial on all of us, because we will become a melting pot and everyone will benefit at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. Yeah, we have that was such a lovely positive note, Zainab. I don't really want to go backwards, but we have this well-known problem in the UK with people from the last 2 generations ago now, really, who came from Pakistan and some other Middle Eastern Muslim countries, and their kids seem less able or willing or happy to integrate and assume British values than even their parents. And that's created a generational division between the parents who sort of came here and tried to be as English as they could, often worked extremely hard on public transport and in factories, and thought their kids would then be more naturally British and move a bit more towards whatever this thing we've all agreed is difficult, but something which is a bit more British in values. And that hasn't happened for whatever reason. In many big pockets of communities, the kids probably experience a lot of low-level racism, some quite difficult cognitive dissonance between home values and other values, and those kids feel naturally very alienated, and so are seeking radical solutions. And yeah, that's very concerning and difficult for everyone, really. I don't know quite, again, where the blame lies. I think you're right, Zainab. It's just a failure all round, but I think in many cases those parents really did try to.
One more layer. There is one more layer I was afraid to talk about, but I think I will go there. And this is if they come from a Muslim background. Unfortunately, sometimes you're going to notice, I'm sure Andrea has noticed this, that sometimes even the parents would be more integrated than the next generation and the generation after, unfortunately. And all of this, I think, is due to the if I may say it, the dark ages of Islam that we're passing through now, and the different interpretation and how they are perceiving this religion that should call for peace and integration and no suppression and no that was like, diverted into many things. So this is also very dangerous. And unfortunately, maybe young people are more prone to misunderstand certain things, and then maybe they feel that they are entitled, or they want to do a certain change, or they want to impose. The problem is when you want to go somewhere else and then you want to try to impose things, because this is how you see it, right? And this is why I think a lot should be done about open-mindedness. And I was, for example, also between bracket here, I know it's outside the kind of sujet a little bit, but for example, what's going on now in Saudi Arabia after these 40 years of, being, under the tough way of dealing with Islam, now with the new crown prince, how he's he's going into, okay, now they call it moderate Islam. For me as a Muslim, this is Islam because to me, they are extremists. They are simply extremists. And they should not do so. This is one of my fears. That's why I was insisting on saying and knowing, speaking their language, meaning going into details, unfortunately, and maybe bringing people that would know more about religion. I'm talking here about government and training programs that would explain or would, like, I don't want to say force them, but would enlighten them to different concepts, that maybe things were going wrong somehow sometimes, but this is not the right way of doing it.
I'm not sure the government really appeals to youth. Youth wants its own culture, meaningful culture. I don't think government programs is going to reach disaffected youth, really. Do you think?
Maybe smaller units, maybe smaller local units like clubs or local units. This is what should be. They should be integrated within the. I think so. It's challenging. It's challenging, but it will pass. It will pass. I'm very optimistic because I'm sure that one day they will all understand that if they all cooperate, this is the only way to for everyone.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Carl, I was wondering about what you said earlier, and it ties, of course, in with what Zainab was saying. So when we this was specifically thinking of immigrants with a Muslim background. Apparently, what you're telling me is the willingness to integrate has sort of gone down over generations. And Zainab
maybe over one generation. I'm not sure about the second generation, but yeah,
okay.
The children of immigrants seem to have more trouble integrating from certain communities than their parents for some reason.
And Zainab mentions that, well, there's the pull of certain variations of Islam that is exerted over these generations. But I'm also wondering whether there might just be a difference in possibility horizons for these people. So I think maybe the first generation might have felt that they could get integrated fully, whereas the second generation just sees like, listen, it's not in my realm of possibilities. So what am I to do? And then the alternative will present itself in like, here you'll get your social cohesion within this perhaps too extremist version of Islam or something else. We'll grasp onto whatever we get if the real possibility is just not available elsewhere.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think there is some research on that. Yeah,
absolutely. There's tons of research on that. So the second generation is very commonly less optimistic than their parents who came as immigrants, because it's also the possibilities there, but it's also the perspective. So if you came from some other situation, you come into a new one, you're hopeful, you're acting, you're getting things done, and you're maybe also a little bit less aware of all of these other soft ways in which you're being excluded. But for groups that are experiencing some kind of discrimination, that second generation sees it in a very different kind of way. And often then they're getting educated in that system. They have the credentials and the skills, but they're experiencing a different kind of context. And so you can often have a second generation that's less optimistic than their parents. And something in particular about religion as well, because there's also what we know is that when people move from one religious societal context, so if you grow up in a Christian dominant society to you might not think about being a Christian because it's just part of the landscape, and that's when the holidays are, and that's just the organization of life. So then you go somewhere else where those holidays are not recognized, and some basic precepts that you just didn't, you thought of yourself as a secular person, but now all of these basic things are gone. So it's a very common thing with the immigrant experience to get a renewed sense of your religion because you didn't have to really think about it before.
As a Lebanese, we don't have this problem at all. I'm sorry, Carl. We don't have this problem at all because we are very diversified. And for example, at Christmas, maybe I think the majority of the Muslim houses will have Christmas trees, and we all, I mean, we really celebrate each other. Okay, what we hear in politics is totally different, but this is a very, very different case scenario here that I don't want to go into. But as a society, as you said, this is very important and very true. So when you are used to this openness, to accepting the other, and especially when the Muslims will realize that they cannot be Muslim if they don't accept all the, I mean, the basic principle of Islam would be accepting all the prophets, because this is being a Muslim. So so that's why I insist that we need to work on specific things, and it's not difficult. And I mean, it might take a little bit of time, but it's also very political because, as you all know, politics is always, religion is always used when it comes to politics. It's much easier to have political agenda based on religion. I mean, certain plans or, you know, trying to manipulate. So, yeah.
Lawrence, can I take us back to benevolence, Lawrence?
Yeah, sure. And then think of, take back to benevolence. And that's one of the few instructions I got today. Is like, by now we should start to wrap up. So Carl, why don't you start a wrap up? Well, maybe on the topic of benevolence, and then pass the microphone to someone else.
Okay, I've been a little bit provocative this afternoon, so I'll wrap up a bit provocatively. I think it's great to be benevolent. I think people should be encouraged to be benevolent and not feel remotely guilty about it. So I'm going to provoke with that. And you know, some of my students are worried now about being white saviors because they want to go and help people in countries which need help. I mean, I just think that's a crazy sort of inversion of the liberal charitable principle. So I'm being provocative, but be benevolent, be kind to people and help them when you can, and don't feel guilty about it. That's me. Hello?
Then what would you be your reflections, and what would you take away from this conversation?
No, I'm just insist on my political science rule that it will be a win-win. I insist on it, and that with proper programming and working all together, they will understand that everyone will end up benefiting from this. Thank you. So Andrea?
So I think I'm really interested in continuing to explore this idea of organizational change, and how can we come up with logics of inclusion that create greater equality and happiness for everyone. So I appreciate having the chance to chat about this. Bram?
Right. Oh. I'm a philosopher. I'm not very good at conclusions. I mainly ask questions or add layers, as I've been doing today. But I think what I want to take away from this is mainly that we need a good grasp on what the motivations are for all the agents involved if we're going to change some of the problems that we're seeing. And I think that's where the empirical research really comes in handy, so to speak. So I'm going to end with a note of curiosity about what it really is that drives us to make these decisions in these cases, and really where the causal handles will be if we're going forward from here on. That's more a question than a conclusion, but as I said, that's what I do. Ross, I think you should wrap it up now as our main convener.
Well, I mean, we still have a few minutes. You were faster than I thought. But so to me, and I really appreciate the fact that we had this conversation where we build on our different expertise and knowledge and also individual experience. And I really Zainab, you said something earlier, and you said, well, of course I'm grateful if I can move to a country where there is no war, where I can where I'm safe. And I've worked with persons who were refugees from war, and they say that and said, I don't care if people look down on me or are benevolent, I'm safe. This is the most important. And so to that extent, it's true. Well, it's true. No, I don't want to say it's true, but it resonates with what Carl and you were saying. Understanding the motivation of the person, it's integration. It's probably inclusion is not a one formula that will fit different social class, that will fit different generation, that will fit, So that's I think that became clearer in this conversation, and to me it's so inclusion is probably an illusion or is a concept or a construct, and maybe I'm not sure whether we should try to define it more or try to conceptualize it more. Maybe it's been sufficiently conceptualized and defined, and now it's about understanding how does it work in practice in a most respectful ways. Yeah. Okay. So in my 2-minute takeaway.
And I just add one thing. I think also school level is very, very important for the generation. So I need them to have specific clubs. I mean, they will not be called club integration clubs because nobody wants to go into such a club. But I mean, to force them, yeah, I mean, just to force them to speak to each other, to force them to find common grounds with each other, to find common interests, to force them in a way to. Because again, it also breaks my heart when I go into a school in Europe and then I see the Middle Eastern, the way they look, and they're like in a group all together, and then another group. So I think teachers should do this extra effort.
Yeah, this idea of forcing. I mean, I know how you didn't mean forcing, but
in a positive way.
Yeah,
in a positive way.
Yes,
because
and
for example, I teach political science, of course. So I have people coming from different parties, and we had atrocities in our 15 years of war. And so I used to force, extreme Christian with the extreme Muslim, please do a project together, try to know each other. And then they end up really finding so much commonalities between them because, especially now it's becoming easier. So anyway, hopefully.
Yeah. Maria, would you like to conclude this conversation or this explorative talk?
Yes, thank you, Lawrence, and thank you so very much, all explorers, for sharing your thoughts and insights. It was so interesting to listen to you and hear your different perspectives of such an important subject. And thank you also the audience for listening to us. So I propose, why don't you bring today's subject with you and with you home and continue the discussion with family and friends. And we look forward here at the Stockholm Academic Forum to an exciting 2023 with several explorative talks. So I recommend you to look at our LinkedIn page for the Stockholm Explorative Talks, where you can find our upcoming events. So thank you for being with us today. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.